The forest had always been a place of refuge for me, a sanctuary from the chaos of the outside world. My name is Walter Grant, and for the past 15 years, I served as the head ranger at Whispering Pines National Park. Nestled deep in the Appalachian foothills, the park was a sprawling, mysterious expanse of towering trees, secluded trails, and dense fog that seemed to breathe its own life into the air. I thought I knew every twist and turn of the trails, every hidden grove and forgotten path. But that year, the forest taught me a lesson I'll never forget. It started innocently enough, as these things often do. Early one morning, I was in the ranger station sipping coffee and checking the daily logs. The air was heavy with the aroma of damp wood and the faint sweetness of decaying leaves. The summer rush had tapered off, and the park was quiet, save for the occasional bird call and the rustling of squirrels. That quiet shattered when the radio crackled to life. "Walter, we've got an issue," came the voice of Emma Tully, one of the seasonal rangers. "A group of hikers didn't check back in last night from the northern trails. Probably just got delayed," I said, trying to sound calm. "But I'll head out and see if I can track them down." "What's their last known location?" "Trailhead for the Hollow Creek Loop," she replied, her voice tinged with concern. "But there's something else. A camper said they heard sounds coming from the woods last night. Not animals. Something different." My stomach tightened, but I brushed it off. I had dealt with my share of ghost stories spun by nervous hikers. I grabbed my gear: map, flashlight, first aid kit, and the .45 revolver we were issued but rarely used. Stepping outside, I took in the forest. The towering pines loomed like silent sentinels, their shadows stretching long in the morning light. As I approached the Hollow Creek trailhead, the wind picked up, whispering through the trees. The air seemed heavier. The further I went, the more the usual sounds of the forest faded. Birds stopped chirping. The underbrush was eerily still. That's when I saw it, a tattered scrap of fabric snagged on a low-hanging branch. It was the kind of bright blue you'd wear to avoid being mistaken for prey during hunting season. Nearby, the ground was churned up as if someone had struggled. My gut told me to turn back and call for backup, but something deeper, a primal curiosity, pushed me forward. The deeper I ventured, the stranger it became. The ground was marked by a series of tracks. Not human, not animal. Something else. Long and clawed, as if a creature had dragged itself along with unnatural strength. Ahead, I spotted something glinting in the underbrush. It was a hiker's backpack, its contents spilled across the forest floor. Nearby, a trail of blood led deeper into the woods. As I stood over the abandoned backpack, the world around me seemed to shrink, the trees closing in like silent judges. The crimson trail leading deeper into the woods glistened faintly in the dim light, and my breath clouded in the sudden chill. The morning sun, once so warm and golden, had given way to a muted grayness that clung to the forest like a shroud. I knelt to examine the blood trail, its fresh, vivid hue contrasting starkly with the moss-covered ground. The drops were spaced unevenly, some smeared as though the injured party, or predator, had paused or been dragged. My radio crackled at my hip, and I nearly jumped. Static hissed, followed by Emma's faint voice, distorted but insistent. "Walter, get out. Not safe. Heard, it's coming." The transmission dissolved into a shriek of static, then silence. "Emma!" I barked into the radio, my voice reverberating in the oppressive quiet. No response came. I could feel my pulse hammering in my temples. Each beat a drumroll of dread. Every instinct screamed at me to head back, to call for reinforcements. But the thought of leaving someone behind, or worse, letting whatever was out there continue unchecked, kept my boots rooted to the earth. The trail wove deeper into the forest, where the canopy thickened and shadows danced like living things. I gripped my flashlight in one hand and unholstered my revolver with the other. The weight of the firearm offered scant comfort against the growing unease that gnawed at my senses. About 100 yards in, the blood trail abruptly veered to the left, leading toward an old, disused hunting trail. My stomach churned as I realized where it was heading: Hollow Creek Gorge. The gorge was infamous among rangers, a jagged, steep-sided chasm that seemed to swallow sound and light alike. Most visitors avoided it, deterred by the treacherous footing and the unsettling atmosphere. But not everything stayed away. The silence deepened as I approached the gorge. Even the faint rustle of leaves had ceased, replaced by a heavy, vibrating stillness. The air smelled wrong, a fetid mix of decay and whetstone. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing the path ahead strewn with jagged rocks and gnarled roots. As I edged closer, I heard it, a low, rhythmic thrum that seemed to rise from the earth itself. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder with each step. It wasn't a sound so much as a vibration that wormed its way into my bones, setting my teeth on edge. My breath quickened, and I realized I was holding the flashlight in a death grip, its plastic casing slick with sweat. The blood trail ended abruptly at the edge of the gorge, where the ground sloped sharply downward into darkness. I swept the flashlight along the incline, searching for any sign of the hikers, or whatever had left the trail. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a tangle of branches perhaps, or an oddly shaped shadow. But as my eyes adjusted, the shape solidified and my stomach dropped. It was a figure, hunched and unnaturally elongated, its limbs bent at sharp angles that defied human anatomy. Its skin, or was it fur, gleamed slickly in the flashlight's beam, and its head turned toward me with a slow, deliberate motion. The eyes were the worst. They reflected the light like a predator's, but there was no warmth or animal cunning in them. They were cold, hollow voids like twin abysses staring back at me. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My hand tightened on the revolver's grip, but my fingers felt like lead, frozen in place. Then it moved, with a speed that was horrifying in its fluidity. The creature bolted down the gorge's slope, vanishing into the shadowed depths below. The thrum in the air intensified, the vibration rising to a low, resonant growl that seemed to reverberate through the gorge itself. I staggered backward, nearly tripping over a root, and forced myself to breathe. My training kicked in, breaking through the haze of fear that clouded my thoughts. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't natural, and it was moving further into the park. If those hikers were still alive, and God, I hoped they wouldn't stand a chance against something like that. Reluctantly, I descended into the gorge, my flashlight casting jittery beams of light as I navigated the uneven terrain. The walls of the chasm rose on either side, narrowing the sky to a thin ribbon of gray above. The oppressive atmosphere seemed to press down on me, growing heavier with each step. About halfway down, I noticed strange markings on the rocks. They weren't natural formations, nor were they the kind of graffiti you'd expect from adventurous teenagers. They were intricate, almost geometric patterns that seemed to pulse faintly under the flashlight's beam. I ran my fingers over one of the carvings, and the stone felt warm. Too warm. The growling vibration returned, louder now, and I froze. It was coming from somewhere below me, echoing up the gorge like a terrible song. I strained to see through the darkness, and then I caught sight of movement, a pale, writhing mass slithering between the rocks far below. It wasn't alone. Shapes began to emerge from the shadows, their outlines distorted and surreal. Some crawled, others slithered, and a few moved upright, their twisted forms barely resembling anything human. My flashlight flickered, and panic surged in my chest. I smacked the side of the flashlight, cursing under my breath, and the beam steadied. When I looked again, the figures had vanished, but the vibration remained, filling the gorge with an almost tangible dread. I had to keep moving. Turning back now wasn't an option. With every step, the feeling that I was being watched grew stronger, the weight of unseen eyes burning into my back. My flashlight swept over the rocks ahead, and my heart skipped a beat. There, sprawled against the gorge wall, was one of the hikers, a young woman, her face pale and streaked with dirt, clutched a jagged wound on her leg. Her wide eyes met mine, filled with equal parts terror and relief. "Help!" she rasped, her voice barely audible over the thrumming noise. I rushed to her side, crouching low to avoid silhouetting myself against the dim light above. "You're gonna be okay?" I whispered, though the words felt hollow. "Can you walk?" She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. It's still here." Before I could respond, a new sound pierced the air, a guttural, inhuman scream that seemed to shake the very earth beneath us. It came from somewhere deeper in the gorge, echoing off the walls like a monstrous war cry. I turned, revolver raised, and braced myself for whatever was coming. The girl clutched my arm, her grip surprisingly strong, and whispered, "Don't let it take me." The girl's trembling grip tightened on my arm as the monstrous scream faded into a low, vibrating growl that reverberated through the gorge. My flashlight beam trembled as I swept it across the jagged rocks ahead, searching for any sign of movement. The oppressive air seemed thicker now, the dark mist creeping along the ground like a living thing. "We have to move," I whispered, though my voice sounded weak and distant, as though the gorge itself was swallowing my words. She nodded but winced, her face contorting in pain as she shifted her weight. Her leg wound was worse than I'd initially thought, a deep gash that oozed blood and sluggish rivulets. Whatever had injured her hadn't just left a physical wound. Her wide, haunted eyes told me that much. I reached into my pack, pulling out a roll of gauze. "I'm gonna wrap this. It'll hurt, but we need to stop the bleeding." She didn't answer, just nodded again, her gaze darting nervously to the shadows beyond us. I worked quickly, binding the wound as tightly as I dared while keeping one eye on the encroaching darkness. Each second stretched like an eternity, every sound magnified in the unnatural silence. "What happened?" I asked as I tied off the bandage, more to fill the silence than out of expectation. "They came out of nowhere," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We were walking, and the forest just changed. It got so quiet. Then we saw it. It wasn't supposed to exist. It's not supposed to exist." Her voice cracked, rising into a panic, and I quickly shushed her. "We'll get out of here," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. I slung her arm over my shoulder, helping her to her feet. Her weight was slight but uneven, her injured leg dragging with every step. The trail back up the gorge felt impossibly far. I scanned the ground for a better path, and that's when I noticed something chilling. The blood trail that had led me to her, it wasn't just hers. It branched off in two other directions, streaking away toward the darker recesses of the gorge. My throat tightened. She wasn't alone down here. "Your friends," I said softly. "Are they?" Her face crumpled, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Ben and Casey. It got them." I tried to run, but it didn't chase me. It just watched. Her words chilled me more than the cold mist swirling around our feet. A predator that didn't chase but watched? I didn't want to know why. We moved slowly, her injured leg hobbling our pace. The mist seemed to thicken the further we went, clinging to our clothes and obscuring the path ahead. The vibrating growl had subsided, but the oppressive feeling of being watched only intensified. Every instinct screamed at me to look over my shoulder, but I forced myself to focus forward. "Almost there," I lied, though the incline ahead told me we were far from the gorge's exit. The trees at the rim were a faint silhouette against the gray sky, distant and unreachable. Then the ground shifted beneath us. At first, I thought it was my imagination, a slight tremor, barely perceptible. But then it came again, stronger this time, the rocks underfoot rattling as though the gorge itself were alive. The girl cried out, clutching at me as we struggled to keep our footing. My flashlight beam wavered, catching glimpses of something in the mist ahead. A figure. No, not a figure. Several. They moved in disjointed, jerking motions, their limbs bending at grotesque angles. Their forms were vaguely humanoid, but their proportions were wrong. Too long, too thin, their heads tilted at unnatural angles as though listening to something only they could hear. "Stay quiet," I hissed, pulling the girl behind a boulder and killing the flashlight. Darkness engulfed us, broken only by the faint glow of the mist that clung to the air. My heart thundered in my chest. every beat a countdown to discovery. The figures moved closer, their movements more deliberate now. I strained to make out details, but the darkness seemed to warp them, making their forms shimmer and distort. A faint clicking sound filled the air, a rhythm that matched the vibrations underfoot. Then they stopped. The clicking ceased, and the figures stood motionless, their heads swiveling in unison toward our hiding spot. My stomach dropped. I gripped the revolver tighter, the cold metal slick in my clammy hand. The silence stretched, unbearable. And then, with a sickening crack, one of the figures' heads tilted backward, bending at an impossible angle until its void-like gaze fixed on the sky. A guttural, wet noise echoed from its throat, a sound that was neither scream nor growl, but something in between. The others responded in kind, their heads snapping back as the noise rose into a collective cacophony. The vibrations in the ground surged, rattling the rocks and sending loose stones tumbling down the slope. The girl whimpered, and I clamped a hand over her mouth, silently praying they hadn't heard. But it was too late. The closest figure snapped its head forward, its hollow eyes locking onto us with a predatory intensity. "Run," I whispered, pulling the girl to her feet. There was no point in staying quiet now. The figures surged forward, their jerky movements accelerating into a horrifying sprint. I aimed the revolver and fired, the gun's report deafening in the confined space. The lead figure staggered but didn't fall. I fired again, and this time it crumpled to the ground, but the others didn't hesitate. They moved over their fallen comrade like insects swarming a carcass, their distorted forms bounding toward us with inhuman speed. We scrambled up the slope, the girl crying out as her injured leg buckled beneath her. I hauled her up, adrenaline numbing my own aches as we climbed. The clicking noises grew louder, accompanied by guttural sounds that seemed to echo from every direction. The rim of the gorge was close now, but the path ahead was steep and slick with loose gravel. Behind us, the creatures closed in, their forms twisting and elongating in ways that defied logic. "Go!" I shouted, half dragging the girl as we scrambled up the last stretch. My legs burned, my lungs screaming for air, but I didn't dare slow down. One of the creatures lunged, its claw-like fingers brushing my boot as I kicked free. We reached the top and collapsed onto the flat ground, gasping for breath. The creatures skidded to a halt at the gorge's edge, their dark forms writhing as though unable to cross some unseen barrier. They watched us, their hollow eyes gleaming faintly in the gray light. And then, one by one, they melted back into the shadows, their distorted shapes vanishing into the mist. For a moment, neither of us moved, our breath coming in ragged gasps as the silence settled over the gorge once more. My heart pounded in my chest, the adrenaline refusing to subside, even as the immediate threat seemed to dissolve into the shadows below. The girl beside me, her face pale and streaked with dirt, clung to my arm, trembling violently. "They stopped," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Why did they stop?" I shook my head, unable to answer. My eyes remained fixed on the gorge's edge, where the creatures had halted. Their retreat hadn't felt like defeat, it had felt deliberate, as though we had crossed into a place they weren't willing or able to follow. The air around us was still unnaturally cold, the faint mist lingering like a warning. Slowly, I pushed myself to my feet, my legs shaky and weak beneath me. "We can't stay here," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. "If they come back." "They won't," the girl interrupted, her voice hollow. "They never crossed the line." I turned to her, frowning. "What do you mean? What line?" She didn't answer right away, her gaze fixed on the ground as though searching for something only she could see. "Ben said they couldn't leave the gorge, that they were tethered to it, but they're getting stronger. They're learning." Her words sent a shiver down my spine, though not from the cold. I helped her to her feet, her weight heavy on my shoulder as we began to move away from the gorge's rim. The forest ahead loomed dark and unwelcoming, the once familiar trails now twisting and alien. "Who's Ben?" I asked, hoping to distract her from the pain of walking. "My boyfriend," she replied softly. He told me stories about this place. about things people used to see in the gorge. I thought he was just trying to scare me. I didn't believe him. Not until her voice trailed off and I didn't press her. We moved slowly, the uneven ground making every step a struggle. My flashlight's beam wavered as I scanned the dense underbrush, half expecting those distorted figures to reappear at any moment. But the forest was empty, save for the oppressive silence that clung to every branch and shadow. The girl's breathing grew labored, each step clearly causing her agony. "We need to stop," she gasped, clutching at my arm. "We can't," I said, though my own body was screaming for rest. "We're too exposed here." "There's a cabin," she said between breaths. Ben and I passed it on our way in. "It's not far." A cabin? That was news to me. I'd spent years patrolling these trails and thought I knew every structure in the park. But the desperation in her voice left no room for doubt. If there was a place to take shelter, I had to find it. "Point the way," I said, adjusting my grip on her to help her limp along. The trail narrowed as we moved deeper into the forest, the trees pressing closer together. The undergrowth was thick here, and the ground grew softer, the faint scent of damp earth filling the air. The mist swirled around us, growing denser with each step. "There," the girl said suddenly, pointing ahead. At first, I saw nothing but trees and shadows. But as my flashlight beam swept across the darkness, it caught the edge of a structure, a small, weathered cabin half hidden by the underbrush. The sight sent a wave of relief through me, though it was short-lived. Something about the cabin felt wrong. The door was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the faint breeze. The windows were dark, their glass fogged over as though the air inside was colder than the chill outside. The cabin's wood was weathered and gray, streaked with dark stains that could have been moss or something else. I hesitated at the threshold, my instincts screaming at me to turn back. But the girl's weight sagged against me, and I knew she couldn't go any further without rest. Pushing the door open with the barrel of my revolver, I swept the flashlight inside. The cabin was small, just one room with a crumbling stone fireplace and a single cot shoved against the far wall. Dust and cobwebs clung to every surface, and the air smelled of mildew and decay. But it was empty, at least for now. I helped the girl onto the cot, her face pale with exhaustion. "Stay here," I said. "I'll check the perimeter." She grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Don't leave me," she pleaded, her wide eyes filled with fear. "I won't go far, I promised. I just need to make sure we're safe." Reluctantly, she released me, and I stepped back outside. The forest around the cabin was deathly still, the mist curling around the trees like ghostly tendrils. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating twisted roots and gnarled branches, but nothing else. As I circled the cabin, I noticed something strange. The ground around the structure was marked with faint symbols, etched into the dirt in a pattern I couldn't decipher. They reminded me of the carvings I'd seen in the gorge. Intricate, geometric shapes that seemed to pulse faintly under the light. My unease deepened, and I hurried back to the cabin, bolting the door behind me. The girl was sitting up on the cot, her arms wrapped around herself as she stared at the floor. "Did you find anything?" she asked softly. "Just some strange markings," I admitted, leaning against the wall. "What's this cabin doing out here? It's not on any of my maps." "It's old," she said. "Ben said it belonged to someone who disappeared years ago. A hunter, I think. No one talks about him, though." Her words sent a fresh wave of unease through me. The cabin's air felt heavier now, the shadows deeper. I sank into the rickety chair by the fireplace, my revolver resting on my lap. "You need to rest," I told her. "We'll head out at first light." She nodded but didn't lie down. Instead, she kept her eyes on the floor, her body tense as though bracing for something. I leaned back in the chair, my own exhaustion pulling at me. But as my eyes began to close, I heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from the window. I froze, my hand tightening on the revolver. The girl's head snapped up, her eyes wide with terror. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it wasn't tapping anymore, but a rhythmic scratching. I turned slowly, my flashlight beam sweeping toward the window. At first, I saw nothing but fog glass and the faint reflection of the room behind me. But then the mist outside shifted, and a shape pressed against the pane. It wasn't one of the creatures from the gorge. This was something else, something darker, more indistinct. Its outline seemed to ripple and shift, as though it were barely tethered to this reality. But its eyes were the same void-like blackness I'd seen before. The scratching stopped, replaced by a low, guttural sound that sent a chill down my spine. The girl whimpered, clutching the blanket around her like a shield. I raised the revolver, my hand shaking, and aimed at the window. The creature didn't move, its gaze locked on me. It wasn't trying to break in, it was waiting. The cabin was silent, save for the rhythmic pounding of my heart in my ears. That thing, whatever it was, remained pressed against the fog glass, its silhouette shifting and rippling like smoke caught in a faint breeze. Its eyes were two empty voids that seemed to pull at my thoughts, demanding my attention no matter how much I tried to look away. The girl's muffled sobs brought me back to reality. She was curled into the corner of the cot, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees. "What is it?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I replied, my voice barely audible. My grip on the revolver tightened, the cold steel a lifeline in the face of the impossible. The scratching had stopped, but the oppressive presence of the creature remained, an almost physical weight pressing down on the room. I took a tentative step toward the window, my flashlight held high. The beam flickered, as though the creature's mere presence was enough to interfere with its function. "I need you to stay calm," I said, more to myself than the girl. "If it hasn't tried to come in yet, maybe it—" The words died in my throat as the creature moved. Not away from the window, but into it. Its form seemed to bleed into the glass itself, the rippling shadow spreading like ink in water. The blackness consumed the pane, swallowing the faint reflection of the room behind me until the window became a mirror of absolute darkness. I stepped back, raising the revolver. The flashlight flickered again, then died completely, plunging the cabin into darkness. "No, no, no," I muttered, smacking the side of the flashlight with my palm. It sputtered back to life for a moment, casting faint, erratic beams across the room, before dying again. "Turn it back on," the girl cried, her voice rising in panic. "I'm trying," I snapped, fumbling for the backup battery pack in my jacket pocket. My fingers were clumsy, slick with sweat, and the battery slipped from my grasp, clattering to the floor. A sound filled the cabin, then, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. It was the same vibration I'd felt in the gorge, only now it was inside, surrounding us. The girl screamed, and I whirled toward her, the revolver raised instinctively. The cot was empty. For a moment, I couldn't comprehend what I was seeing. She had been there just seconds ago, and now there was nothing but rumpled blankets and the faint scent of fear lingering in the air. "No, y whisperat, stop incluse. No, no, no." The hum deepened, growing louder and more insistent. My ears ached from the pressure, and the floor beneath me seemed to vibrate in time with the sound. I turned back to the window, my eyes straining to pierce the darkness that now enveloped the cabin. The shadow was gone, but the darkness remained, a living thing that seemed to pulse and writhe, creeping along the edges of the room like tendrils of smoke. I stumbled back, tripping over the overturned chair and landing hard on the floor. The revolver clattered from my hand, skittering across the wooden planks. Before I could reach for it, the darkness surged forward, engulfing me in a wave of cold that stole the breath from my lungs. It wasn't just an absence of light, it was an absence of everything. Sound, warmth, even the solidity of the floor beneath me seemed to vanish, replaced by a void that stretched endlessly in every direction. I was floating, weightless, surrounded by nothingness. My limbs felt heavy, unresponsive, as though the void was sapping my strength. And then I heard it, a voice, faint and distant, calling my name. "Walter!" It was the girl. Her voice was strained, desperate, but unmistakable. Where are you? I called, my words swallowed by the oppressive emptiness. I can't see you. Help me, she pleaded, the sound coming from all around me. Please help me. I tried to move, to reach toward the sound, but my body refused to obey. Panic set in, my chest tightening as the realization sank in. I was trapped. The void wasn't just around me. It was inside me, filling my lungs with every breath, coursing through my veins with every beat of my heart. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The cold receded, the darkness lifting like a veil, and I found myself back in the cabin, sprawled on the floor. The revolver was still within reach, and I snatched it up, scanning the room with wide, frantic eyes. The girl was standing by the window. At first, relief flooded through me. She was alive, but then I noticed the way she stood, rigid, unmoving, her back to me. Her head tilted slightly to one side, as though listening to something only she could hear. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice hoarse. She didn't respond. Slowly, I got to my feet, the revolver held at the ready. "Hey," I said again, stepping closer. "We need to get out of here. It's not safe." Still, she didn't move. Something was wrong. The air around her shimmered faintly, like heat rising from asphalt on a summer day. "Turn around," I said, my voice trembling. "Please." She did. Her face was wrong. Her eyes, once wide with fear, were now black voids, identical to those of the creature I'd seen at the window. Her mouth hung open in a silent scream, her skin pale and waxy, as though all the life had been drained from her body. "Run," she said, though her lips didn't move. The word echoed in my mind, clear and insistent. Run before it's too late. I didn't need to be told twice. Clutching the revolver, I bolted for the door, yanking it open with trembling hands. The forest outside was bathed in a dim, unnatural light, the mist thicker than ever. I stumbled into the underbrush, the cold air biting at my skin as I ran. Behind me, the cabin groaned, the sound of splintering would echoing through the trees. I didn't look back. I couldn't. All I knew was that the thing in the window wasn't done with me yet, and it wouldn't stop until it had me. I didn't stop running until my legs gave out beneath me, my knees buckling as I stumbled into the mossy underbrush. The forest was impossibly dense here, the mist swirling around me like a living thing. Each breath came sharp and shallow, the icy air tearing through my lungs. I leaned against a twisted tree trunk, trying to steady my trembling hands. The revolver felt heavier now, its cold weight and anchor pulling me back to reality. My mind was racing, every shadow a potential threat, every sound a harbinger of something worse. Somewhere behind me, the cabin stood, or what was left of it. I couldn't bring myself to look back, to risk seeing what I already knew was there. "Keep moving," I muttered to myself, forcing my legs to cooperate. My boots sank into the soft ground as I trudged forward, every step an act of willpower. The forest was unervingly quiet, the usual symphony of rustling leaves and distant animal calls replaced by a heavy, unnatural stillness. The mist thickened as I pressed on, clinging to the ground in roiling tendrils that coiled around my ankles. It seemed to pull at me, dragging me down with every step. I had no idea where I was going. There were no trails here, no familiar landmarks to guide me. All I could do was move away from the cabin, away from the thing that had taken her. But even as I walked, I felt it, the oppressive weight of eyes watching me from the shadows. It wasn't just the creatures from the gorge. I could sense something else, something deeper. The forest itself seemed alive, its gnarled trees leaning toward me, as if whispering secrets I wasn't meant to hear. A faint noise broke through the silence, a low, rhythmic tapping, like the sound of raindrops against a hollow log. It was distant at first, barely audible, but it grew louder with each passing second. My grip on the revolver tightened as I scanned the shadows, my heart pounding in my chest. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling despite my effort to sound firm. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, a void that seemed to stretch into eternity. My breath caught in my throat as I strained to listen, every muscle in my body tense for the inevitable. Then, without warning, the ground beneath me shifted. It wasn't an earthquake, not exactly. The movement was too deliberate, too localized. The mossy earth rippled like water, undulating beneath my boots and throwing me off balance. I stumbled backward, my flashlight falling from my hand and clattering to the ground. The mist parted ahead of me, revealing a dark, gaping fissure in the earth. It was narrow, barely wide enough for a person to fit through, but impossibly deep, the blackness within seeming to pulse with a life of its own. The rhythmic tapping resumed, louder now, echoing up from the depths of the chasm. I froze, my instincts screaming at me to run, but my legs refused to move, rooted to the spot as though the earth itself held me in place. The sound grew louder, more insistent, until it seemed to vibrate through my bones. And then, from the darkness, something began to emerge. At first, it was just a shadow, a faint ripple against the inky blackness. But as it rose, its shape became clearer. It was humanoid, but only just. Its limbs were elongated and bent at unnatural angles. Its movements jerky and disjointed, like a marionette controlled by an unseen hand. The thing's head tilted toward me, its void-like eyes locking onto mine. I couldn't look away, my body paralyzed as it crawled closer, its clawed fingers scraping against the edges of the fissure. The tapping sound was coming from it, a rhythmic beat emanating from its chest with each labored movement. Finally, my survival instincts kicked in. I raised the revolver, aiming directly at the creature's center mass, and pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, deafening in the stillness, and the thing jerked violently before collapsing back into the darkness. But the relief was short-lived. The ground around the fissure began to crack and splinter, widening as more shadows stirred within. Dozens of faint, glowing eyes appeared, blinking in unison as the rhythmic tapping became a cacophony of sound. The air grew colder, the mist swirling faster as the creatures began to rise. I turned and ran, my boots slipping on the damp ground as I pushed myself forward. The rhythmic tapping followed me, growing louder with each passing second. I risked a glance over my shoulder and felt my stomach drop. They were everywhere, crawling from the fissures, emerging from the mist, their twisted forms moving with terrifying speed. Their eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, like distant stars in a black void, and their limbs stretched and twisted as they pursued me. My lungs burned, my legs screaming in protest as I sprinted through the dense forest. I could barely see, the mist obscuring everything beyond a few feet. The trees loomed like giants in the fog, their branches clawing at me as I stumbled forward. Then ahead of me, I saw it, a faint light flickering in the distance. Hope surged through me, driving me forward with renewed energy. The light grew brighter as I approached, revealing the outline of a fire, a small campsite nestled in a clearing. I burst into the clearing, my chest heaving as I stumbled to a stop. The fire crackled weakly, casting flickering shadows across the ground. Beside it, a man sat hunched over, his back to me. He wore a tattered jacket, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. "Help!" I gasped, dropping to my knees. "Please, they're coming." The man didn't move. I crawled closer, my vision swimming as the adrenaline began to wear off. "We have to go," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "They're right behind me." Still, the man remained silent. My eyes darted to his hands, which were clasped tightly around something. A wooden box, weathered and cracked with age. There were markings on its surface, similar to the ones I'd seen in the gorge. "Sir?" I reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. The man's head tilted slightly, the brim of his hat lifting just enough for me to see his face, or what was left of it. His skin was gray and withered, his eyes sunken into hollow sockets that seemed to glow faintly in the firelight. His lips parted, and a single word escaped in a rasping whisper. "Run!" Behind me, the rhythmic tapping grew louder. The rhythmic tapping swelled into a cacophony that seemed to pierce the very fabric of the forest. It wasn't just sound, It was something more, something that reached into my chest and squeezed my heart with icy fingers. My breath hitched, my hand still on the withered man's shoulder, and for a moment I couldn't move. His hollow eyes locked onto mine, and though his face was frozen in death, his lips seemed to whisper again, urging me with more desperation. "Run!" The words shattered my paralysis. I scrambled to my feet, my revolver clutched tightly, and spun around. The forest beyond the clearing was alive with movement. Shadows writhed and twisted in the mist, their distorted forms emerging and retreating like waves crashing against an invisible shoreline. The tapping grew louder, a dreadful heartbeat pounding through the earth itself. The withered man remained motionless, clutching the strange wooden box to his chest. My gaze lingered on him for a split second longer. On the faint carvings etched into the box, symbols that seemed to ripple and shift as though alive. "Who are you?" I demanded, though my voice was barely audible over the growing noise. His gaze didn't falter, and for a brief, horrifying moment, I swore I saw something moving inside his empty eye sockets, something dark and restless. Then, without warning, he crumbled. His body collapsed into a heap of ash, the wooden box tumbling to the ground with a soft thud. The air seemed to ripple around the box as it lay there, the markings on its surface glowing faintly in the firelight. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to leave it alone, to flee into the forest and never look back. But something about the box, its weight in the clearing, the unnatural hum emanating from it, held me in place. Behind me, the shadows surged closer. The tapping turned into a deafening roar, and I knew I didn't have time to think. I lunged forward, grabbing the box with trembling hands. The instant my fingers touched it, a shock ran through me, cold and electric, freezing me in place. Images flooded my mind, flashes of an ancient, primeval forest bathed in an otherworldly glow, strange figures moving through the mist, their forms as alien as the shadows that pursued me now. And something else, something vast and monstrous, watching from the void. A scream tore from my throat as I ripped my hands away from the box. The vision ceased, but the cold lingered in my bones, an ache that felt as though it had always been there. Clutching the box tightly, I turned and ran, the sound of the shadows chasing me spurring my legs into motion. The forest seemed to warp around me as I fled. The trees twisted and bent, their branches forming clawed hands that reached for me. The mist thickened, swallowing the faint light of the fire behind me and plunging the world into darkness. My flashlight sputtered weakly in my pocket, but I didn't dare stop to retrieve it. "Keep going," I whispered to myself, the words barely audible over the pounding of my heart. "Don't stop. Don't look back." But I did look back. The clearing was gone, swallowed by the mist. In its place, the shadows surged forward, a tide of writhing forms that moved with an unnatural fluidity. Their limbs stretched and twisted, their glowing eyes fixed on me with an intensity that burned into my soul. One of them broke from the pack, its elongated body snapping forward like a whip. I turned just in time to see it lunge, its clawed fingers inches from my shoulder. Without thinking, I swung the revolver up and fired. The shot echoed through the forest, impossibly loud, and the creature jerked backward, its form distorting as though made of smoke. It dissolved into the mist, but the others didn't slow. If anything, they moved faster, their shapes coalescing into a wave of darkness that threatened to consume me. I stumbled, my foot catching on a root, and fell hard to the ground. The wooden box slipped from my grasp, landing with a hollow thud a few feet away. Panic surged through me as I scrambled forward, my fingers brushing against the carved surface just as the shadows closed in. A deafening crack split the air, and the ground beneath me trembled. The mist recoiled, swirling violently as the shadows halted their advance. For a moment, everything was still. Then the box began to hum. It was faint at first, a low vibration that seemed to resonate in my chest. The carvings on its surface glowed brighter, illuminating the forest around me with an eerie, pulsating light. The shadows writhed and hissed, their forms flickering as though caught in a strong wind. I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew one thing. The box was keeping them at bay. Clutching it tightly, I rose to my feet and began to run again, the humming growing louder with each step. The forest seemed to react to the box's presence. The trees leaned away, their twisted branches parting to create a narrow path ahead. The ground beneath me grew firmer, the mist thinning as though retreating from the light. I didn't question it. I ran, the box clutched tightly to my chest, its carvings warm against my skin. The shadows pursued me, but their movements were slower now, their forms flickering and distorting with each pulse of light from the box. Finally, I burst into a clearing, a real one this time, bathed in the faint glow of the moon. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for breath, the box slipping from my grasp to rest on the soft grass. The forest around me was silent, the oppressive tapping replaced by a stillness that felt almost sacred. The shadows lingered at the edge of the clearing, their eyes watching me from the darkness, but they didn't cross the boundary. I reached for the revolver at my hip, its cold weight a comfort in my trembling hands. But I didn't fire. Something about the clearing felt protected, as though I had crossed into a space they couldn't reach. The box's glow began to fade, the humming subsiding into silence. My fingers hovered over its surface, hesitant to touch it again. What was this thing? And why did it seem to hold power over the creatures that had pursued me? As I sat there, trying to catch my breath, I heard it again, the faintest whisper carried on the wind. Not safe. Not yet. I turned, scanning the clearing, but there was no one there. Only the shadows, watching from the edge of the mist. The clearing was unnervingly quiet, the kind of silence that pressed against my eardrums and made the faintest sound feel deafening. I sat in the cold grass, the wooden box lying inert before me, its glow now extinguished. The weight of exhaustion bore down on me, but I couldn't let my guard slip, not with those shadows lingering at the edges of the clearing. I tightened my grip on the revolver, the metal slick in my damp palm. My eyes darted between the tree line and the box, half expecting one of the shadowy forms to rush forward or the box to spring back to life with its eerie hum. Neither happened. The shadows remained where they were, watching silently, their shapes flickering and indistinct. Not safe. The whisper came again, soft and ethereal. It was impossible to tell its origin, as though the forest itself had spoken. Not yet. I rose to my feet unsteadily, my legs shaking beneath me. My gaze fixed on the box, the carvings on its surface now faint and dormant. Whatever force it had awakened seemed to be dormant again. But for how long? I crouched and carefully picked it up, its weight heavier than before. The moment my fingers touched it, a faint ripple of energy coursed through me, like the static shock you'd get from touching a doorknob after walking on carpet. It wasn't painful, but it was a reminder of the box's unnatural power. The whisper came again, closer this time. Find the path. My head snapped up, scanning the clearing. My heart pounded as I spun in place, the revolver raised. There was nothing there but trees, shadows, and mist. But I couldn't ignore the command. Whether it was a warning or a lure, I couldn't risk staying where I was. The shadows at the edge of the clearing shifted restlessly, their glowing eyes locked onto me. The uneasy truce wouldn't last forever. I tucked the box under my arm and moved toward the side of the clearing where the trees seemed less dense. Find the path, the voice repeated, insistent but calm. I stumbled into the forest, the mist swallowing me whole. The faint light from the clearing behind me quickly faded, leaving only the suffocating darkness. My flashlight was still in my pocket, but I hesitated to use it. The box's glow had repelled the shadows, and I didn't trust a mundane beam of light to do the same. The forest seemed alive with movement, the mist writhing and twisting like tendrils reaching for me. The faintest noises reached my ears, soft rustles, distant clicks, and the occasional low, guttural growl. I tried to block them out, focusing instead on the ground beneath my boots. That's when I saw it. Faint markings, barely visible against the forest floor, etched into the moss and dirt. They were similar to the carvings on the box, intricate, geometric patterns that seemed to pulse faintly when I stepped closer. They formed a trail, winding through the trees and deeper into the mist. "Follow," the voice urged. I hesitated, every fiber of my being screaming that this was a trap. But the shadows were closing in again. I could feel their oppressive presence at my back. Whatever danger lay ahead, it couldn't be worse than what was behind me. I stepped onto the trail. The markings glowed faintly beneath my boots, their light spreading outward like ripples in water. As I moved, the glow intensified, casting an eerie light that illuminated the twisted trees around me. The mist seemed to part before me, though the darkness pressed in from every side. I followed the trail in silence, the box clutched tightly in one hand and the revolver in the other. The markings led me deeper into the forest, winding between gnarled roots and jagged rocks. The air grew colder, the mist denser, and the oppressive silence deepened. The trail ended at a stone archway. The structure was ancient, its surface worn smooth by time and weather. The carvings on the arch mirrored those on the box, their intricate patterns glowing faintly in the dim light. Beyond the archway was nothing but darkness, an impenetrable void that seemed to swallow all light and sound. The whisper returned, louder now. "Enter." My stomach twisted in fear. Every instinct told me to turn back, to leave the box and flee into the forest. But the shadows were behind me, and the darkness before me seemed to pulse with a strange, magnetic energy. I stepped closer, the hum of the box growing stronger as I approached the archway. "Enter," the whisper repeated, more urgent this time. I took a deep breath and stepped through. The world shifted. It wasn't like walking into a dark room or stepping into a shadowed space. It was a complete and total dislocation, as though I had been torn from one reality and thrust into another. The air was heavy and thick, the ground beneath me soft and yielding. The mist was gone, replaced by a faint, otherworldly glow that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. The trees were different here, taller, with twisted trunks that spiraled upward into an endless void. Their leaves shimmered faintly, casting strange patterns of light and shadow across the forest floor. I turned to look back, but the archway was gone. There was no sign of the trail or the markings that had led me here. I was alone, or so I thought. The first sound I heard was faint, a soft, rhythmic clicking like the sound of bone against stone. It echoed through the forest, growing louder with each passing moment. My grip on the revolver tightened as I scanned the shadows, my heart hammering in my chest. They emerged slowly, their forms flickering and indistinct, like static images projected onto a rippling surface. They weren't the same shadows that had pursued me before. These were taller, thinner, their movements more fluid and deliberate. Their eyes glowed faintly, but they weren't the void-like blackness I'd seen before. They were pale and luminous, like distant stars. The largest of them stepped forward, its elongated limbs moving with a terrifying grace. It stopped a few feet away from me, its head tilting slightly as it studied me. I raised the revolver, the barrel trembling as I aimed at its center mass. The creature didn't move. Instead, it spoke, not with words, but with a low, resonant hum that vibrated through my very bones. The sound was both alien and familiar, like a distant memory brought to life. My vision blurred, the world around me twisting and warping as the sound filled my head. The box began to hum in response, its carvings glowing brighter than ever. The creature's gaze shifted to the box, its form flickering violently as the glow intensified. The hum grew louder, resonating between the box and the creature, until it reached a deafening crescendo. And then the light exploded. The explosion of light wasn't blinding, it was enveloping. It consumed the alien forest around me, searing through the strange trees and the towering forms of the creatures. It wasn't just light, it was sound, vibration, and force resonating through every fiber of my being. The hum of the box peaked, and for a moment, I thought I was going to disintegrate under its sheer intensity. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. I opened my eyes, when had I closed them and found myself sprawled on the ground. The box lay a few feet away, its carvings dim and lifeless. My revolver was still in my hand, though my fingers ached from the tight grip I'd maintained. The alien forest was silent, the creatures nowhere to be seen. But the world around me had changed. The trees were still impossibly tall and twisted, but they no longer shimmered with that faint, otherworldly light. Their bark was blackened and cracked, and the ground beneath me was no longer soft and glowing but hard and dry, covered in ash. The air was heavy with the acrid scent of burning, and a faint wind stirred the ash in swirling eddies. I pushed myself to my feet, my legs trembling beneath me. The box caught my eye, and I reached down to pick it up, hesitating as my fingers hovered over its surface. It felt dormant now, its power spent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me, waiting for the right moment to awaken again. I tucked the box under my arm and scanned the area. There was no sign of the creatures, no trace of the towering figure that had spoken to me in that strange, resonant hum. But I wasn't alone. A figure stood in the distance, barely visible through the haze. It was humanoid, but its proportions were wrong. Too tall, its limbs too long. It didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence, but I could feel its gaze locked on me. I gritted my teeth and gripped the revolver, my finger hovering over the trigger. "Who are you?" I called, my voice echoing unnaturally in the still air. "What do you want?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised one impossibly long arm and pointed. I followed its gesture, my gaze shifting to the horizon. Far off in the distance, barely visible through the haze, was another archway. It looked identical to the one I'd stepped through to enter this world, its stone surface etched with the same glowing carvings. The figure lowered its arm and turned, striding away into the ash. It moved with a strange, loping gait, its elongated limbs bending in ways that made my stomach churn. Within moments, it disappeared into the haze, leaving me alone once more. The box grew warm under my arm, and a faint hum began to emanate from it. The carvings glowed dimly, pointing me toward the distant archway. I didn't trust it, but what choice did I have? The archway was my only hope of escape. I began to walk. The journey was grueling, each step sinking into the ash-covered ground. The air was thick and heavy, making every breath a struggle. The wind carried faint whispers, too soft to make out, but persistent enough to send shivers down my spine. As I walked, I noticed shapes moving in the distance. At first, I thought they were mirages, tricks of the light. But the closer I got, the clearer they became. They were remnants of structures. Half-collapsed buildings, shattered towers, and jagged spires that jutted from the ground like broken teeth. The remnants of a city. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Whatever this place was, it hadn't always been like this. Once, it had been a civilization with people, culture, and life. Now, all that remained was ash and ruin. My mind raced with questions. What had happened here? And why had the box brought me to this place? I moved cautiously through the ruins, my eyes darting to every shadow. The faint whispers grew louder here. Not words, but a collective murmur, as though the very walls were trying to speak. I passed what looked like a shattered fountain, its basin filled not with water, but a viscous black liquid that seemed to writhe and pulse like a living thing. The box grew warmer, its hum more insistent. The carvings glowed brighter, casting flickering light across the ruins. I followed its guidance, weaving through the broken streets until I reached the base of a massive tower. It was the tallest structure I'd seen yet, its spire piercing the ash-filled sky. The archway was at its base, its carvings glowing faintly in the dim light. Relief flooded through me as I approached, but it was short-lived. A shape moved in the corner of my vision. I spun, raising the revolver, and saw a figure standing at the edge of the ruins. It wasn't one of the elongated creatures I'd seen before. This was human, a man, dressed in tattered clothing, his face obscured by a hood. He stood motionless, watching me, his presence unnervingly still in the shifting landscape. "Who are you?" I called, my voice shaking. The man didn't answer. Instead, He raised a hand and pointed at the archway, mimicking the gesture of the figure I'd seen earlier. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the ruins. The box's hum intensified, and the carvings on the archway flared to life. I stepped closer, the warmth from the box searing against my side. This was it, my way out. But as I reached for the archway, a deafening roar erupted behind me. I turned just in time to see the black liquid from the fountain erupt into the air, coalescing into a towering, writhing mass. It was formless, a shifting amalgamation of shadow and substance, and it moved with terrifying speed. Tendrils lashed out, ripping through the ruins as it surged toward me. I didn't think. I ran. The archway glowed brighter as I approached, the carvings pulsing in time with the frantic beat of my heart. The box in my arms grew hot, the hum now a deafening roar that vibrated through my bones. The creature behind me shrieked, a sound that tore through the air like jagged glass. I reached the archway and threw myself through it, clutching the box tightly. The world twisted and spun, the light blinding me as reality itself seemed to unravel. And then, just as suddenly it stopped, I was lying on cold, damp ground. The mist was gone, replaced by the familiar scent of pine and earth. The forest around me was quiet, the oppressive weight of the otherworldly realm lifting from my shoulders. I was back, but the box was still in my hands, its carvings glowing faintly in the moonlight. The forest around me was familiar but wrong, like a dream warped by subconscious fears. The towering pines that had once felt protective now seemed oppressive, their shadows stretching impossibly long under the faint moonlight. I stood slowly, the box still clutched tightly in my hands. Its faint hum had subsided, replaced by a quiet warmth that pulsed against my skin. For a moment, I simply breathed, savoring the taste of real air. It was damp and earthy, tinged with the crispness of pine. But the relief didn't last long. The silence was too complete, too deliberate. There were no animal calls, no rustling leaves, just an endless, oppressive stillness that seemed to press against my ears. I scanned my surroundings, trying to get my bearings. The trail I had followed earlier was gone, the trees forming a dense and impenetrable wall in every direction. Only one path remained, a narrow corridor carved through the undergrowth that seemed far too deliberate to be natural. The box pulsed faintly in my arms, as if urging me forward. I wanted to throw it away, to cast it into the shadows and never look back. But I couldn't. Whatever this box was, it had power, power that had saved me from the horrors of the otherworld, power that might still save me again. I adjusted my grip on the revolver, its cold weight a comfort against the unease settling in my chest. Fine, I muttered to no one in particular. Show me the way. The path twisted and turned, the forest growing denser with each step. The moonlight barely penetrated the canopy above, leaving me to navigate by the faint glow of the box's carvings. The ground beneath me was soft and uneven, the smell of damp earth thick in the air. As I walked, faint noises began to reach my ears, soft whispers, too faint to make out, but insistent enough to keep me on edge. They seemed to come from all around me, blending into the rustle of unseen movement in the undergrowth. I kept my revolver raised, my finger hovering over the trigger. The path opened suddenly into a clearing, and I stopped in my tracks. In the center of the clearing stood a massive tree, its twisted roots forming a gnarled mass that spread across the ground like the grasping fingers of some ancient beast. The tree's bark was dark and cracked, and its branches stretched impossibly high, disappearing into the shadowed canopy above. At the base of the tree, partially obscured by roots and moss, was another archway. This one was different from the others I had seen. It was larger, its carvings more intricate and glowing with a faint, pulsing light. The air around it felt charged, like the moments before a lightning strike. My skin prickled as I stepped closer, the box in my arms growing warmer with each step. I reached the archway and hesitated, my gaze drawn to the carvings. They were more detailed than the ones on the box, the patterns forming strange, almost recognizable shapes. Faces maybe, or something pretending to be faces. I touched one of the carvings, and a shock ran through me, sharp and electric. The whispers in the forest grew louder. I turned, my breath catching as shapes began to emerge from the shadows. They were tall and elongated, their forms flickering like smoke caught in a faint breeze. Their eyes glowed faintly, fixed on me with a predatory intensity that made my stomach churn. One of them stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. Its gaze shifted to the box in my hands, and for the first time, I felt a pulse of emotion from the creature. Not anger, not hunger, but fear. The box's hum returned, louder now, and the carvings on its surface flared to life. The creature hissed, a sound that sent shivers down my spine, and retreated into the shadows. The others followed, their glowing eyes fading as they melted back into the darkness. But the whispers remained, louder now, filling the air with a cacophony of sound. They weren't words, not exactly, but I could feel their meaning in my bones. They were urging me forward, toward the archway, toward whatever lay beyond. I didn't want to go. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to leave this cursed forest behind and never look back. But the box pulsed insistently in my hands, and the whispers grew more urgent. With a deep breath, I stepped through the archway. The transition was different this time. There was no flash of light, no disorienting twist of reality. One moment, I was in the clearing. The next, I was somewhere else entirely. I stood in a cavernous space, its walls lined with glowing carvings that pulsed in time with the box in my hands. The air was thick and humid, the faint smell of earth and decay filling my nostrils. Ahead of me, a narrow stone bridge stretched across a yawning abyss. The whispers were louder here, echoing off the walls in a dissonant chorus. They seemed to come from the abyss itself, rising and falling like the tide. The box in my hands grew hot, its hum now a steady drone that vibrated through my bones. I stepped onto the bridge, my boots scraping against the rough stone. The abyss on either side was impenetrable, an endless void that seemed to swallow the faint light of the carvings. The whispers grew louder with each step, their tone shifting from urgent to pleading. Halfway across the bridge, I stopped. Something was moving in the abyss. At first, it was just a faint ripple, a distortion in the darkness. But as I watched, the ripple grew, forming a massive shape that rose slowly from the void. It was impossible to make out details. The creature's form was constantly shifting, as though it was made of liquid shadow. But its eyes were unmistakable. They were the same void-like eyes I'd seen in the creatures before, but larger, more intense. They locked onto me, freezing me in place with their terrible weight. The whispers fell silent, replaced by a deep, resonant hum that seemed to shake the very air around me. The box in my hands pulsed once, then went silent. The creature surged forward, its massive form flowing across the bridge like a wave. I raised the revolver and fired, the shot echoing in the cavern, but the bullet passed through the creature without effect. It didn't slow, its eyes fixed on the box. I turned and ran, the bridge shaking beneath me as the creature closed in. The exit was so close, just a few more steps. The creature lunged, its shadowy form wrapping around me like a vice. The box fell from my hands, clattering to the ground as the shadows engulfed me. The last thing I saw was the faint glow of the carvings, flickering like a dying flame. And then, there was only darkness. The darkness wasn't just an absence of light. It was a suffocating void, thick and oppressive, pressing against my skin like cold, wet fabric. I couldn't tell if my eyes were open or closed. There was nothing to see, no up or down, no sense of direction. My body felt weightless, floating in a sea of blackness that seemed to stretch into infinity. But I wasn't alone. I could feel it, something massive and ancient coiled around me in the dark. Its presence was overwhelming, filling the void with a tangible weight. I couldn't see it, but I could feel its eyes, burning into me with an intensity that made my chest tighten and my thoughts scatter. And then the whispers returned. They were faint at first, threading through the silence like a soft breeze. But they grew louder, weaving together into a chorus of voices that echoed in my mind. They weren't just sounds, they were emotions, memories, fragments of thoughts that were my own. I clutched at my head, trying to block them out, but it was useless. The voices were inside me, filling every corner of my mind with their dissonant song. I couldn't make sense of them, couldn't focus on any single voice, but one emotion rose above the chaos. Hunger. It wasn't my hunger. It was the creatures, an all-consuming void that craved something it couldn't define. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. It wasn't after me. It was after the box. My hand shot out blindly, grasping for the wooden box. The hum that had once pulsed through it was silent now, its carvings cold and lifeless. My fingers brushed against its surface, and a jolt of energy shot through me, sharp and electric. The whispers faltered, the chorus breaking apart into scattered murmurs. The darkness around me rippled, and I felt the creature hesitate, its presence recoiling slightly. I gripped the box tighter, holding it like a shield, and focused on the carvings. "Work," I whispered through gritted teeth. "Come on, work." The box remained cold and unresponsive, its carvings dim and inert. The creature's hesitation faded, and the darkness surged forward, enveloping me in a wave of icy shadow. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, battering against my mind like a relentless storm. "Stop!" I screamed, my voice swallowed by the void. "Leave me alone!" And then something answered. It wasn't a voice, not exactly. It was a presence, vast and incomprehensible, pressing against my thoughts with an alien intelligence. It wasn't the creature. It was something older, something deeper, and it spoke a single word: release. The box grew warm in my hands, its carvings flaring to life with a blinding light. The hum returned, louder and more powerful than before, resonating through the void like a beacon. The darkness recoiled, the whispers dissolving into silence. The creature shrieked, a sound that shook the very fabric of the void. I felt its presence retreat, pulling away from the light that radiated from the box. The warmth spread through me, dispelling the cold and filling me with a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in what seemed like hours. The void rippled and twisted, and for the first time, I could see the creature. Its form was massive and amorphous, a shifting mass of shadow and light that seemed to defy logic. Its eyes burned with an otherworldly intensity, fixed on the box in my hands. "Release," the presence said again, louder this time. I didn't understand what it wanted, but I didn't have time to think. The creature lunged, its shadowy tendrils reaching for me with terrifying speed. I raised the box, the carvings blazing with light, and the tendrils recoiled, disintegrating into smoke as they touched the glow. The box's hum grew louder, the light intensifying until it was almost unbearable. The creature shrieked again, its form writhing and twisting in the light's intensity. The void around us rippled violently, and I felt the ground beneath me shift. And then the box spoke, not in words, but in feelings, memories, fragments of thoughts that weren't my own. I saw glimpses of a world that was once vibrant and alive, a civilization that had thrived before being consumed by the same darkness that now surrounded me. I saw the box, a creation of that world, forged to contain and control the void. But something had gone wrong. The box hadn't contained the darkness. It had connected to it, drawing it closer to the world it was meant to protect. The presence in the box wasn't a savior. It was the bridge, the link that allowed the void to seep into reality. "Release," the presence urged again, more insistent now. I realized what it wanted. The box wasn't a weapon or a shield. It was a key, and it needed to be turned. I hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on me. If I released the box's power, would it destroy the void? Or would it unleash something even worse? I didn't know, and there was no time to find out. The creature lunged again, its massive form closing the distance between us in an instant. I raised the box, my fingers tracing the glowing carvings. The warmth pulsed through me, filling me with a strange sense of calm. And then I turned the key. The light exploded outward, blinding and all-encompassing. The void screamed, its shadowy form disintegrating in the wave of energy that surged from the box. The whispers ceased, replaced by a deafening silence that stretched on for what felt like eternity. When the light finally faded, I was no longer in the void. I stood in the clearing where it had all begun, the towering pines looming overhead. The box was gone, its weight lifted from my arms, and the revolver lay on the ground at my feet. The air was still, the oppressive silence replaced by the faint rustle of leaves and the distant call of an owl. I sank to my knees, my body trembling with exhaustion. The memory of the void lingered in my mind, a shadow that refused to fade. But I was alive. Somehow I had made it back. The forest around me was quiet, peaceful even. But I knew better. The void wasn't gone. It had only been pushed back. And the box, wherever it was still out there, waiting for someone else to find it. I knelt in the clearing, staring at the empty ground where the box had once been. The forest around me seemed almost serene, the rustling of leaves and the faint chirp of insects a sharp contrast to the suffocating silence of the void. But the peace felt hollow, like the calm before a storm. The box was gone, but I didn't feel free. Its weight still lingered in my mind, like a phantom limb, and the memories of the void refused to fade. The forest didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like something watching me, waiting for my next move. I staggered to my feet, my legs unsteady beneath me. The revolver was still lying on the ground, its barrel coated in dirt. I picked it up, the cold steel a small comfort against the overwhelming sense of unease that clung to me. My gaze swept the clearing, searching for some sign of what had happened, of what I'd done. There was nothing. No glow, no carvings, no trail leading me back to answers. Just the forest, as still and quiet as a photograph. I turned and began walking, each step heavy with exhaustion. The forest felt endless, the familiar trails twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. The trees seemed to shift when I wasn't looking, their shadows growing longer and darker. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The first sign of something wrong came as I approached the ranger station. The building loomed ahead of me, its windows dark and lifeless. But something was off. The air around it felt colder, heavier, as though the void itself had followed me back. The trees closest to the station were twisted, their bark blackened and cracked like the remnants of a fire. I stopped at the edge of the clearing, my heart pounding in my chest. The door to the station hung ajar, swaying slightly in the breeze. I raised the revolver, my finger hovering over the trigger, and stepped forward. Inside, the station was dark. The faint smell of damp wood and mildew filled the air, but there was another scent beneath it, something acrid and metallic. My flashlight flickered weakly as I swept it across the room, illuminating the overturned chairs and scattered papers that littered the floor. "Hello." My voice sounded small in the empty space, swallowed by the oppressive air. There was no response. I moved further inside, the beam of my flashlight casting jittery shadows across the walls. My desk was still there, the coffee mug from earlier in the day sitting untouched. But something else caught my eye. A single piece of paper lying in the center of the desk, its surface marked with strange, jagged symbols. They were the same symbols I'd seen on the box. I picked up the paper, my hands trembling. The markings seemed to pulse faintly in the flashlight's beam, as though they were alive. As I stared at them, a faint whisper reached my ears, a soft, dissonant hum that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The sound grew louder, and I turned, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The door to the station slammed shut, the sound reverberating through the room. My breath caught in my throat as the temperature dropped, frost forming on the windows and creeping across the walls. The whispers grew into a cacophony, a dissonant chorus that filled the station with an unbearable weight. My head throbbed, my vision swimming as the shadows on the walls began to move. They twisted and writhed, coalescing into shapes that were both familiar and alien. And then I saw it, In the corner of the room, half hidden by the shifting shadows, was the box. Its carvings glowed faintly, their light casting eerie patterns across the walls. It pulsed softly, the hum growing louder with each passing second. No, iwisparat, stumbling backward. You're gone. I destroyed you. The box didn't respond, but the air around it seemed to ripple, bending reality in ways that made my stomach churn. The shadows moved closer, their forms flickering like smoke caught in a faint breeze. I raised the revolver, aiming at the box, but my hands were shaking too badly to hold steady. "Leave me alone!" I screamed, pulling the trigger. The shot rang out, the sound deafening in the confined space. The shadows recoiled, twisting violently as the bullet struck the box. But it didn't stop. The carvings flared to life, their light blinding and searing, and the hum grew into a deafening roar. I fell to my knees, my hands covering my ears as the light consumed the room. The air grew heavy, the walls trembling as the station seemed to warp and twist around me. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. I opened my eyes, and the station was gone. I was standing in the forest again, the trees looming tall and silent around me. The box was gone, the clearing empty save for the faint glow of the moon above. But the forest didn't feel right. The shadows were deeper, the air colder, and the silence more oppressive than ever. I took a step forward, and the ground beneath me shifted. Looking down, I saw faint carvings etched into the soil, the same symbols that had marked the box. They pulsed faintly, leading deeper into the forest. The whispers returned, soft and insistent, threading through the trees like a distant melody. I didn't know where they were leading me, but I couldn't ignore them. The box had taken me somewhere I wasn't supposed to go, and it had left something behind, something I couldn't escape. As I walked, the forest seemed to close in around me, the path ahead disappearing into darkness. The whispers grew louder, their tone shifting from pleading to demanding. I tightened my grip on the revolver, though I knew it wouldn't save me. The forest stretched endlessly before me, a maze of shadows and whispers that seemed to have no end. The box was gone, but its influence lingered, a shadow that would haunt me forever. I wasn't sure if I would ever escape the forest, or if I was doomed to wander it for eternity. And as the whispers grew louder, one thought echoed in my mind. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed.